what I love is that you guys are tackling U.S. foreign policy in a nuanced way, because I think, I don't know, without getting into specifics, I have issues with the way some people on the left cover foreign policy, and more importantly, what goes down internationally in various countries. I think that there tends to be a black and white view of things, which ends up discrediting the left in the way that they engage in these conversations. So the nuance is really, really important. So why don't we start off with your thoughts regarding the Biden administration so far, with, you know, what he's done foreign policy wise?
Sure. And that's one of the things, Anna, that we're going to try to do with the podcast, which it's difficult to really feel foreign policy in the same way one can feel economic policy or social policy, or certainly something like healthcare policy or welfare policy. And so what we're going to try to do is try to relate these issues to what is actually going on in people's lives. It's one of the things that we could do. It's a very complex sphere of life. There's decades and decades of nefarious U.S. actions that have understandably, I think, engendered a type of conspiratorial attitude amongst many people who analyze U.S. foreign relations, because truth be told, the United States has done a lot of conspiratorial things in the past. As everyone listening probably knows, the overthrow of democratically elected governments, what you all and Ben were just talking about with relations to Cuba. So there's a lot going on. So what we hope to do is sort of bridge the gap between what people in DC, or what might be referred to as the blob, think, and what people on the traditional anti-imperialist left think, which we think there's a lot there to both to the critique coming from the anti-imperialist side, but also related to how people in DC talk, to build, we were all speaking about Michael Brooks, to help kind of build the cadre of people who might one day, should a socialist win the presidency, it didn't happen this time, but it may happen in the future, who might one day go into office. And then this brings us to the question, of course, about Biden. And I think, and we could probably get into it a little bit more deeply, but what I see from the Biden administration is kind of an attempt to manage hegemony, a shrinking hegemony, whereas it's not a full retreat from, U.S. imperialism, but it is somewhat of a retreat from the unipolar moment, which is our lifetimes, essentially. We're all born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s and 2000s, the idea that the United States is the only global superpower. And I think there's a recognition amongst the blob, again, that this is not going to be the case. It's no longer the case, in fact. So the question is, how do you manage this hegemony? And as I wrap up here, I just want to say, I don't think we're witnessing real imperial decline. I think we're witnessing some type of imperial retrenchment.
Now, Biden is a liberal, and you are a professional historian, one of the last, maybe, as you talk about a lot. But you're paid to study history, and your area of expertise is liberalism and foreign policy. So it's a good moment for you because Biden is a liberal and he's doing foreign policy. How would you describe liberalism as an idea or an ideology, and what is kind of the liberal foreign policy?
Sure. So I think when I'm talking about liberalism in this way, I'm not really referring to, the Democratic Party is liberal or the Republican Party is conservative. But you are right, Nando. I think Biden is a liberal in many senses of the term. What I'm really referring to here is this idea that started to get going in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was originally associated with the capital P progressive movement, which was the notion that you would be able to genuinely manage international affairs, that international affairs was a realm of action in which, great men, obviously men, literally, at the time, at the turn of the century, would be able to sort of rearrange international politics to fit into ideals. Woodrow Wilson famously did this with, the idea of ethnic nationhood, essentially, that happened at the end of World War I. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did it with the type of world making that happened toward the end of World War II. And all of Roosevelt's Roosevelt's successors from Truman on down to Biden really think that you could remake the world. So one of the things that I think a left-wing criticism could do, what Derek Davison and I are trying to do on the podcast, American Prestige, is to really attack that worldview. This idea that international affairs is a place to be managed scientifically. It's a place to be managed like a chessboard. You often hear that metaphor of international affairs as sort of the great game. But the problem is it's not a game. And to view it like that through that metaphor, I think actually distorts what the United States is able to do, has accomplished or not accomplished in the world, and what a future left-wing foreign policy might look like given the realities of geopolitics.
It's like a game of Risk, dude. You know, like
right.
you
exactly
move the pieces here, and you take over the Ukrainian steppes, and then you invade from the north, and you do a pincer movement, and then you're good.
And one of the things that we see in American culture day in and day out in ways we don't even recognize is that message is taught in everything from our high school curricula to our movies to our video games. Americans are taught that they're the actors of history. They're the heroes of history. And I think that attitude, which really got going at, again, the turn of the 20th century, but peaked when the United States became an empire during and after World War II, is really damaging. That it winds up distorting what might be considered more organic developments on the ground. And I think you can understand U.S.-Cuba policy, right, in that regard. This idea that the United States has anything to say, the idea that America should manage Cuba in a meaningful way, which has been going on since the 19th century, is, I think, part of this fantasy that you are able to manage international relations, the fantasy that ultimately undergirds both the liberal internationalism of someone like Samantha Power or Hillary Clinton or Anne Marie Slaughter, and the neoconservatism of someone like Paul Wolfowitz or Donald Rumsfeld or Doug Feith or Richard Pearl. This notion that you could control politics in that way is, I think, misguided.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about just the kind of education Americans get while they're in grade school about U.S. history and our role internationally speaking. And I hate to bring this up because I feel bad at how terrible the co-host looked during this interaction, but I thought about Ryan Grimm's interaction with the other person he's been hosting with on The Rising. I don't know her name, but how shocked she was in regard to what really went down during World War II and Stalin's role in defeating the Nazis, right? And she was just like shocked because the overwhelming narrative in the United States and in our education system is like, and then the United States got involved and defeated the Nazis single-handedly without any help from anyone else.
Tom Hanks beat the Nazis.
Yeah. And particularly in our lifetimes, in all of our 3 lifetimes, this was really the narrative of the 1990s, right? Because without the Soviet Union, this empire should go away, right? You're justifying it for literally 2 generations because the Soviet Union, they're horrible, they're evil, blah, blah, blah. But the Soviet Union collapses between 89 and 91. And so the empire should come home, right? But what happened, of course, is that they needed a new justification for empire. And that justification winds up becoming preventing genocide for a variety of particular historical circumstances, particularly the United States' failure to intervene in Rwanda in 94, and then in the collapsed Yugoslavia in 1995, the anniversary of this, I always pronounce it incorrectly, the Srebrenica, forgive me, massacre. And so what happened was this new justification for empire became the Holocaust, right? Became the prevention of genocide. And so along with the dissemination of this meta narrative, this literally like Hegelian narrative of history, became a downplaying of what the Soviet Union did. And of course, with regard specifically to the Holocaust, it was the Soviet Union that liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, because the death camps, when we think of, there were concentration camps where people were concentrated and lots of people died, don't get me wrong, but there were death camps that were specifically built for extermination. Those were in Eastern Europe because Hitler didn't want them in Germany and for a variety of reasons. So they were liberated, the ones that were still functioning at the war's end, by the Soviet Union. So literally the liberators, the enders of the specific Eastern genocide of the Jews was the Soviet Union. And that was totally erased from history. And so it's 30 years later now, and so you have a generation of people who are politicized traumatized by narratives like that, who were raised on Saving Private Ryan, who were raised on Call of Duty, who have no, Call of Duty actually did have Russian soldiers, but whatever, who were raised without a sense that this was an effort that the United States didn't do alone, that it was actually, the sacrifice of tens of millions of Soviet citizens and many soldiers that enabled the victory of World War II. But instead, the lesson of World War II was U.S. global power. And I think that's a historically incorrect lesson, though it's the one that people have taken.
Yeah. You're known for some of your spicy takes, and one of your spicier ones was that you tweeted out that in a way you feared liberals more than you feared the people who stormed the Capitol, and people were very mad at you about that. It's obviously like a provocation in a way, but what did you mean by that?
I honestly didn't think it was a provocation, because the way that I view it is in terms of a power analysis. So who controls the mechanisms of the American security state, both the domestic security apparatus, the surveillance of the NSA, ICE, Coast Guard, the police forces to some regard, and also, of course, the mechanisms of international security, the international security apparatus, the U.S. military, and all of its various branches and the weapons that it maintains. And so what I was doing was just, the analysis between the actual controllers of the liberal American states versus the Capitol rioters. And so it really didn't seem like a provocation, because at the time, I mean, obviously, and I don't want to underplay, it's obviously very scary for someone to personally experience that if you were in Congress or if you were there. This is not, something to dismiss easily, people's concerns. But when you're looking at it from a political perspective, what I was worried about at the time was that exaggerating something which I didn't view as a threat to the Republic, which is literally how it was being presented, as it was a coup attempt, which means the attempt to literally take over the control of the government, never really seemed like that to me. It seemed like something bad, a riot, and certainly had some very unsavory motivations, racism, xenophobia, hero worship of Trump, etc. What I was worried about was the overreaction by the American state, because I think the last 20 years has shown, and one might even say, as someone who studies the formation of this state in the 40s, since World War II, the last 76 years have shown that the state tends to expand its powers, and particularly the state tends to expand its security powers, and it is often looking for excuses to do so. So what I was just pointing out at the time was that this should really be the fear of this enormously powerful apparatus that could know where any one of us is at any moment, and through the mechanism of the drone could literally kill anyone in theory. It's something to be really worried about, and I think I was justified in that worry, given the recent moves by the Biden administration to do things like characterize DVEs, believe it's domestic violent extremists, as people who are anarchists or anti-capitalists, and things that might might be associated with the left. And I'll just continue here. I just have to say, in American history, one of the groups that have suffered most from this empowerment of the security state have been people of color, have been the left, and have been people who are dissidents to the status quo authority.
So I want to move over to Cuba. I know we've discussed it quite a bit on the show already, but I'm getting word regarding Jen Psaki's statements about what the U.S. plans to do. Press Secretary Jen Psaki says U.S. approach to Cuba is governed by two principles: empowering the Cuban people, even though we're still keeping sanctions in place, which cripples its economy. Second, Americans, especially Cuban Americans, are the best ambassadors for freedom and prosperity in Cuba.
Right. So she said that. Yeah, right. So this is the classic Biden. Sorry, I'm moving out of frame. This is classic Biden administration of maintaining hegemony. That's a status quo foreign policy, right? Like the continuation of the sanctions that have been going on, as you talked about, for decades, a reliance on sort of the Cuban American community to guide U.S.-Cuban relations. Frankly, I think this points to a general problem. Is that because Cuba is just not on the top of the list of concerns for the overwhelming number of Americans. So in many of these issues, particularly in terms of foreign policy, but also domestic policy, highly organized groups are going to have a significant interest on what goes on. And this has been going on since the formation of lobbying groups in the 19th century, oftentimes along ethnic lines. And so I think that's basically a throwing your hands up. Biden's not going to do a Bay of Pigs, because that would be really bonkers. And he's not even going to do the sort of drone surveillance that was done in Waziristan, for example, over the last several years. But he's just going to say, we're going to let things run their course. The United States is going to continue to do sanctions. We're going to continue to do what we've been doing for decades, and nothing's going to change because because the Western Hemisphere, since the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, that's the United States'. And I just want to point out, this is when it's very absurd when people ever accuse the United States of being isolationist, because from the very beginning of the beginnings of the country's history, one could view, I think correctly, as the expansion westward, as the displacement of native indigenous peoples, as, an expansionist, non-isolationist foreign policy. And then over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the domination of Latin America and the entire Western Hemisphere could hardly be understood as isolationist. So I just think it's important to highlight that historical point, because the word isolationism is used and misused far too often.